Hello, everyone, and welcome to this video review of S.C. Hinton's The Outsiders. If you're like me, you missed this book in middle school and high school. A lot of people are required to read it at that time. I missed it. It's widely considered the first young adult novel ever written. The author wrote it in 1967 when she was a teenager herself. And she wrote it because she wanted to see the experiences of teenagers that she knew and had been around reflected. She didn't see the experiences of teenagers and young adults reflected in the things she read, and she wanted to correct that. The story is character driven. It's an ensemble, a cast, if you will. Our narrator is a kid named Ponyboy Curtis. He narrates his own life as well as the lives of his family. He lives with his older brother, Daryl, who everybody calls Derry. His um, his second brother, his middle brother, I should say his second oldest, he's the youngest. His second oldest is Soda Pop, and that is his real name. Um, it's not a moniker. And then they have their three boys. They were orphaned about 8 months before this book began because their parents were in a car crash and were killed. And now Derry, the oldest boy, is charged with keeping them together. So he's basically working like an adult would work. He has two jobs. He works himself, pays the bills, does all that. Soda Pop, who's 16, drops out of school, and he goes to work at the local gas station. Soda Pop can drive anything on wheels, and he is good with cars, so he works at the gas station. Pony Boy is still in school. He's very studious young man. He's very smart, makes good grades. The thing that works against these boys is that they are basically from the wrong side of town and they're poor. They are known as greasers because they like to put grease in their hair to slick it back, and they do have a tendency toward delinquent behavior, not usually a lot of violence, but definitely delinquency, although there are people in their circle who are violent. There are some important side characters in this book that we meet. There's a character by the name of Darrell Winston who is very violent, has been to juvenile hall, has been to jail. There's another side character that is a buddy of theirs named Johnny. They call him Johnny Cake, who is abused at home. And then there's some other side characters that we meet that play prominent roles in the book. But essentially, what this book focuses on is the day-to-day struggle between the greasers, who are, you can think of them as like the lower count poor thugs, and the socials or the socialites. And one of the main thrusts of this book is the class divisions and the tendency to judge people on the basis of the appearance or what happens. So greasers and socials are enemies. Greasers, as I said, are sort of stereotyped as these sort of thugs that are up to no good, and they're not very smart most of the time, and they just kind of like to be violent and make trouble for people. The socials are known to be kind of rich and stuck up and very privileged and conceited, and they do a lot of the same things. They get drunk at parties, they break things, they vandalize things, they might shoplift or steal, and they don't get the same penalties because their riches or the riches of their parents, if they're younger, insulate them from a lot of consequences that would otherwise happen. And so the majority of this book focuses on class divisions and how the environment may or may not shape behavior. There's, besides the class distinctions and sort of the don't judge a book by its cover kind of theme in this book that comes out, there's another theme that runs through it that's very much what is it that makes a person behave and present the way they do. Ponyboy is in this household where, you know, his household's been broken up, and he's got some buddies that are, you know, in some really questionable behavior. He's got some buddies that are really more than just delinquent, they're criminals. And yet Ponyboy is this studious young man who keeps his head above water. He wants to read books, he wants to watch sunsets, he wants to appreciate poetry and play music. He's got a very sensitive soul in there. And then you have this other character, Johnny, who's a buddy of the whole group, and he's living in an extremely abusive situation where he doesn't like to be at home because he literally gets beaten almost to death by his father very regularly. And so, but yet he becomes anxiety ridden. Obviously, he has a lot of symptoms of today what we would probably call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But he loves the gang. They're very tight knit, and Johnny doesn't have all of the same opportunities. He just wants to be loved and cared for, which is perfect in this setting because this sort of loose affiliation provides sort of an extra family for him. And it also shows how some of the gang activity that we can associate in certain urban places shows you how that can happen when you get young men who are lost and who are excluded and who are marginalized, and they're looking for a group to fit into and somebody to care for them and affirm them. You can see how that sort of comes about. So there's that theme in there. There's all kinds of family dynamics themed because there's a running thread with how long the brothers are going to stay together and what's going to happen to them. Throughout the course of the book, we see some of the consequences that take place. The plot engine, besides all of this social class struggle, is this conflict that happens between one of the socias, and Ponyboy and Johnny are involved in that. Johnny more tangentially. They all get involved, but basically, Pony Boy gets physically assaulted by one of these socias for a reason that's clear in the book. And um, it's basically one of those cases where we don't like who you're going out with and you're too good for us and stay in your own lane kind of situation. Um, and then that leads them to this whole adventure, if you will, where they have to run away and run for their lives and they become criminals. And then there's a twist that comes later in the book where that whole narrative gets turned on its head, which also shows how sometimes there's things going on under the surface of somebody's life, no matter who they are, that you can't know. And you can't know how somebody will react in a situation and what they'll do just based on who you think they are. So there's a lot of questions about who do we think these characters are and who are they really? Not because the narrator is unreliable, but just because there's more layers to the character, just like there are to most people. Who are they really? And I think put in extreme situations, what would they do? This novel does stand the test of time. Some of the references are dated. There's a lot of 60s references to cars and movies and movie stars. Paul Newman is mentioned, and if you look up Paul Newman, he was a famous actor of the time, and he was kind of one of the role model celebrities that people aspired. He was very handsome, so a lot of people had platonic crushes or they had admiration for him and for his work. So you find that in here. You find a lot of references to vehicles and other cultural aspects of things that we don't see now. But I think overall, what The Outsiders is trying to show us is that much of, I wouldn't say all maybe, but much of the socioeconomic differences that we have, even today, between races, between social groups, a lot of that is artificially constructed based on perceptions that we gain. And we learn those perceptions because we see certain things happening. We make assumptions about the people who do those things as a group. And that's another thing that is in this book. Like, Pony Boy is a greaser. He admits it, and he's not the best educated, and he does engage in some of that behavior, not nearly to the same extent as some of his other buddies, but he engages in that behavior more or less because the people he's around do, and he has limits because he doesn't want to be that. And so there's questions about, can you make choices and how much of your choice to engage or not engage is influenced by your environment, your desire to survive. And these things are learned. I mean, he learned these things about the socias. The socias learned these things about him. And in the course of this book, there are different places where people they don't necessarily leave the stereotype, but they definitely do push the boundaries of the stereotype. So you see Pony Boy pushing against that, I'm a thug and I'm poor and I'm not smart and he's deep, he reads, he does all this, and you have you have one of the socios in particular, one of the social characters um, who Pony Boy becomes close to, Sherry Valance, and she actually stands up for Tony and his group, but she doesn't ever quite break out of her shell in that sense. But she does do them a good turn or two, and you see glimpses of something. There's a scene um toward the 2/3 of the way in, I would say, where they're talking, Pony Boy and Sherry Vance, and Sherry knows that Pony Boy likes to watch sunsets, and he says, "Does the sunset look the same on the west side? Can you see the sunset from the west side?" And she says, "Yes." And he said, "I can see the sunset from the east side." And basically, they figure out that they're looking at the same sunset from two different points of view, but basically it's beautiful for both of them. And I think there's a sense in which, so there's all kinds of themes that you can explore, but there's a sense in which a shared humanity is what we're trying to get at. Yes, we don't all look the same. We don't all dress the same. We don't have the same sensibilities. We definitely don't have the same opportunities as other people, but we do share the same humanity, and we each have our own sets of problems. And that's a little bit about what this small book explores. It's not all that long as a classic. If you've read it, it does have some problems. It is somewhat dated, but there's a reason why people are still reading it around 60 years after it was published. Definitely worth your time if you haven't read it, and definitely worth a discussion post or two. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Maybe you've learned a little something about the book. Maybe I've given you a few thoughts to explore further. And I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.